Yeah, when went up top side, they had the bodies laid out there on the quarter deck. And I went by to see if I could recognize anybody. And we lost 50 some odd people.
Well, you just heard from Ted Washington Kuykendall. He was a warrant electrician, U.S. Navy, World War II, and his story is very special. He was on the USS Nevada, the battleship that was stationed in Pearl Harbor on December the 7th, 1941. The only ship to get underway while the Japanese attack was happening. And we're going to have his story for you today. This is a special series. Please stick around. We've got a great story for you. My name is Ryan Fairfield.
And I'm Tony Lupo.
And we got a great show. Stick around. Okay, so Tony, man, I've been looking forward to this series for a while. I think this is the first Pearl Harbor veteran we've had on the Warrior Next Door podcast that was a guy who was there. I mean, a lot of these guys in the Pacific came through Pearl Harbor after the attack happened, and they described the battle damage that was still happening. One guy, Wish Lemons, came through right away, like the day after Pearl Harbor, but never any guys that were there in the battle. And this guy here, Ted Kuykendall, was there. How long ago did you do this interview, and how did you meet Ted?
Yeah, so this interview was conducted in October of 2007 in Tulsa, Oklahoma, when I still lived there. Right now I live in Denver, but there was I lived in Oklahoma for about 9 years, and you and I interviewed just a lot of people, and we got connected with Ted Kuykendall at the Pearl Harbor Survivor Association that met every month at Ollie's restaurant. It's a great breakfast, by the way.
Ollie's, yes,
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, for people who aren't from Tulsa, which is probably just about everyone in our audience, Ollie's was this really interesting area near a train yard, and it had this train theme, and it had these trains that would go around the walls. And I would bring my boys there. My kids at this time would have been 5 years old, and they loved going to Ollie's. They didn't, I think, fully comprehend, because they'd take us all the way to the back of the room. And that's where the meeting was. I don't think they fully comprehended why we were there, or, who these old dudes were that were talking about stuff. But it was actually his daughter, Harriet, who said, hey, my father can't make it to all of these. But he was on the USS Nevada when Pearl Harbor was attacked. And for people who, I think most of our audience knows about Pearl Harbor, but if you can think in your mind's eye to any movie on Pearl Harbor where you got the actual attack scene being recorded, like Tora, 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 the Nevada always plays a huge role in that, because it was the only battleship that had made steam, meaning it had its boilers were active. It made steam, and it was able to actually try to escape the fate that faced most of the battleships that day during the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it was not able to escape. But you can see in any of the Pearl Harbor movies, you can see this scene of the Nevada trying to get the hell out of this cauldron of fire. And our guy, Ted, was below deck as an electrician, doing everything he could to restore comms and allow the ship to leave. So we're going to hear some really cool stuff today from a guy who had a front seat at a very historic event.
I was doing some reading about the Nevada prior to the show, and one of the things that it also had going for it is the fact that it was moored at Ford Island just after the Arizona, and so from what I read, it actually had the ability. It wasn't hemmed in by another ship. It had the ability to break free and get out of there, whereas other ships were more confined, I think is the right word to say it. So
you're absolutely correct. When we get to the point where we're going to talk more about Pearl Harbor and Nevada's where it was positioned, Ryan, you're absolutely correct. If people can see in their mind's eye, and this will be a YouTube podcast as well, we'll add some video to this. But on Ford Island, a lot of these battleships were stacked up 2 by 2. They had sealed the inner battleship in, which actually helped in some ways because the torpedoes couldn't reach the inner battleships. But yeah, the Nevada and the California were the only two ships that were outside of this sardine packing configuration. But it's just amazing. I can still remember as a little kid watching Tora 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 with my dad, and
Man.
all these ships were blowing up and they're sinking, and the freaking Japanese planes were flying everywhere, and all of a sudden the Nevada is making steam. It is moving. There are
Yeah.
bombs crashing around it, and I remember little kids like, get out of there. You can do it. You can make it. We can save the Nevada. And I didn't think that I would in my later years. Here I am in my 50s. We're gonna share with our audience a dude who was there, not just some movie thing, but what really happened. This can be so cool.
All right. Well, I want to jump in now. Let's get going on this. So here we go. We're going to kick off the first clip here with Ted Kuykendall.
And while I was going to school, my last year in school, I graduated in '39, and at that time, Europe was involved. You know, my thought was that this country is going to be involved in it sooner or later, one way or the other. So I decided I'd rather be in a board ship with a clean bunk than be in the foxhole. So I joined the Navy, and a friend of mine and I we tried to join the Navy earlier, and he was overweight and I was underweight. And so later on, that was in the spring, right after we got out of school. And then later on, December, I tried again, and they did take me that time. So I went in January the 5th, 1940, down in Dallas.
Yeah, so many of these guys, like, just a little background for our audience. So, the draft didn't start for the United States after the attack on Pearl Harbor. FDR and the administration knew that there was a good chance we're going to get in the war. And we covered the peacetime draft in an earlier episode. So the peacetime draft started in 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor was attacked, with the idea being, hey, we need to get people in the military and you get them trained up. So if we get involved in this fracas, then we'll have trained troops. A lot of men, and Ted was one of them, said, well, screw that. I'm not going to wait for the draft. I'm going to go. Chances are I'm going to get drafted anyways. I'm going to go pick the service that I want to join. And it's just kind of funny how he's like, yeah, I didn't want to be in some foxhole somewhere. Yeah, you just end up on a ship getting bombed by the Japanese in Pearl Harbor about a year later. That was so much safer than what your plan A was.
We were tracking on that. I was sitting there listening to it because each of these guys had these rather simplistic way of choosing what branch they're going to go into. Yeah. And it's the same thing. Yeah. Well, I didn't want to be in a foxhole, so I wanted to be in a clean bunk. And it's funny because think about it. Each one of these branches of the military had their own ridiculous, horrific, scary part of the job, you know? And one of them, if you're, okay, fine, you're not going to be in a foxhole. But at least on a foxhole, you're not going to get your ship blown out from underneath you and you drown in the water with potentially a bunch of sharks. Okay.
Yes. Yeah. Or hey, I think planes are great. I'll just fly in bombers. How dangerous can that be at 30,000 feet over?
Oh, I mean, the technology had only been around for what, maybe 30 years at that point, at the most, to be flying at 30,000 feet.
This is unique in the sense that most of the people that we interview didn't join until after Pearl Harbor was attacked. And Ted saw the writing on the wall and decided to join almost a year earlier.
Yeah. Okay. So I remembered what I was going to say. Okay. So anybody who's ever been, Tony, have you been on a cruise?
No, I've been on a car ferry.
Well, kid, no, that's not what I'm talking about. Okay. Like an honest to goodness big ship with thousands of people on it.
I'm afraid of the norovirus and all that stuff that happens on them.
So there you go. I mean, that's part of it. I remember we went on a Disney cruise one time. Okay. I took my kids on a Disney cruise. My wife and I had never been on a cruise. And so we're like, oh, we'll check this out. People love this stuff, Yeah. So we went, and first thing they do is you do the evacuation drill. It's like, oh, okay. Well, am I going to where do we go again? Downstairs, and you put life vests on and everybody's crammed into the hold, and they explain how they're going to put you on a lifeboat and all that kind of stuff. And it's just a safety meeting, but still that's a little unsettling, you know? And you think about it, and then the whole rest of the time I'm on the boat, I'm going, I don't really like this. This is a little, somebody gets sick or we hit an iceberg or something. This could be freaking mayhem. This could be mayhem. Then the Costa Concordia thing happens too, and you're like, what is, this is crazy in this day and age to think that. And then think about that and the fact that, okay, you've got all that to worry about, and then some, because you're actually in a war where people are out there looking for you, and they are going to try to sink your ship.
Yeah.
And so I just marvel. I always marvel at these guys. But, I guess if you got to choose the three, I mean, have a 3 squares a day and, a warm cot at night, I guess that makes sense to a lot of people. But
it would, until the attack occurred, and then at that point they were like, "Oh man, I've chosen poorly." But who would have thought that?
You've chosen poorly.
You have chosen poorly. But who would have thought, right, that was going to happen? And so the Japanese military at this time, especially the Navy, was probably the best trained carrier force in the world. The British would have been right there. It would have taken us about another year to get to where the Japanese were. So a lot of bad things were going to happen. But so he joins the military. And on this next clip, this is interesting because he talks a bit about his training. And he didn't just go right to the USS Nevada. He had a stint on another ship before he would be transferred to Nevada. And on this next clip, he talks about that.
Could you describe your training, what you were ultimately trained to do?
Oh, of course, I went through boot camp there, and then I went on special detail. And then went board ship on the old Nietzsche's tanker, went out to Pearl Harbor and went aboard the USS Nevada. And originally I was on the 6th Division for a while, and I went to Fleet Machine Gun School on the old Utah. And then I got transferred into later on into the E Division, electrical division. And so it was interesting work. Of course, the ship was an old ship. It was a sister ship to the Oklahoma. And there's only 2 of that class built. But the old Nevada was the first oil-burning ship ever built, a battleship. And it was the first 3 gun turret built. And of course, I always say that she being the oldest battleship out there in Pearl, out of the 9 battleships, she was the oldest and the only one that got underway. So people shouldn't discourage old age because it's still got movement to it when you give it a chance, It's just slow about moving around.
So if he didn't transfer right to the USS Nevada. He did some training on some other ships, and he would not be on the USS Neches, Neches, which is an old oiler that was commissioned in 1920. It was small, it was slow, but it was one of the handful of oilers that were left after the Pearl Harbor attack. And one of the things that people say about Pearl Harbor was the Japanese made a mistake by not bombing the oil tank farm that we had there. Well, that's true, but we still had early in the war problems getting oil delivered to our ships, not because we didn't have the oil in the tank farms. We didn't have enough of these oilers to bring the oil out to the fleet. So these oilers would travel behind the main fleet. They can only do about 15 knots, right? And an aircraft carrier will do 30. These old battleships would do about 20, 21 knots. But they didn't have enough of them. I thought I read somewhere that after Pearl Harbor, we had like 5 of them in the Pacific. And by the end of the war, we'd have many, many more than that. In fact, my grandfather, Phil Dion, the main reason why we have that I became involved with you, Ryan, in this Veterans History podcast, listening to my grandpa tell stories. He started off on USS Colorado, and then after Tarawa, he ended up being transferred to an oiler called the Tomahawk. And at this point, these oilers were a lot faster. So he was on an oiler for a little while. And you may think, well, geez, I mean, what kind of crappy luck for him to get transferred to the Nevada right before the attack? Well, it turns out if he stayed on that oiler Neches, it wouldn't have ended much better, because just a few months after Pearl Harbor, in fact, January 22nd of 1942,
Wow.
Not even a few months after Pearl Harbor.
6 weeks later.
Yes. I-72 sank the USS Neches, where they say about 150 miles west of Pearl Harbor.
Wow.
So yeah, even if he had stayed on, quote unquote, the safer ship, and I don't think there was a safer ship in the Pacific during World War II, it would have ended up being sunk.
Didn't he say that he was on the Utah also?
Yep. He did training
So-
on Utah.
And the Utah was, of course, sunk at Pearl Harbor.
Yep. And it was a training ship on the other side of Fort Island, I think. And the Japanese is like, okay, we'll sink this too. They
Wow.
did, even though it wasn't part of the main battle fleet at the time.
Mhm.
So I thought that was interesting. He talked a little bit about the Nevada. We're going to talk more about that. Maybe after clip 6 or so, but go ahead and play the next clip, Ryan. There's 2 of them. He's going to
Okay.
talk about life aboard ship and some other things that I didn't know about. We'll go ahead and unpack it when he's done telling us.
Working in the E division, we had a regular circuit to take care of, either heavy machinery, blower circuit or something. And you made your rounds, checked your motors and all this, that, and the other, and other stuff like that. And the old ship had 120 DC as main power, which very few people know or use that power anymore. But that was the main power for the ship. Had four generators, 2 fore and 2 aft, and steam-driven generators. She was a steam-driven, turbine-driven ship. On maneuvers, and go out on read detail and have maneuvers at different times in general quarters at night, and drills and drills and drills. You got sick and tired of drills, and of course, just like anything else, the better training and all you have, why the better off you are. And so the training paid off, I think, for not only me, but I mean for the people on the ship. Of course, when you, but still going through a routine like that, and it gets anything like that. You've got that many. There's that much activity, and it was all out there at Pearl, and that was, my guys, there was more soldiers and sailors out there in Pearl or in Honolulu area than there was any place else in the country. Because I think our nation was anticipating more than we knew. We didn't know a whole lot what was going on, but diplomatically and everything else, they knew that something was happening, getting ready to happen. And that's the reason they called all the fleet back in. Because never before had the fleet been back in Pearl. There was 96 ships in Pearl on the day of the 7th.
Wow.
I did not know that.
I didn't either.
I did not know that one of the reasons a lot of the ships were in Pearl Harbor at the time is because according to what Ted's saying, the U.S. government, the military intelligence agencies realized that there was something going on. They didn't know when, they didn't know where. I don't think it's a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. I don't think anyone thought it was going to be Pearl Harbor, right? We were thinking maybe some of our overseas possessions in the Philippines, and that they called the ships back in. The other thing that I remember reading is the main reason that the battleship division was there. He talked about the 96 ships, but the battleships in particular, is because Halsey had the carriers out on an exercise, a resupply mission, I believe, to Midway. And these old battle wagons, we'll unpack this right now, they couldn't go more than about 21 knots. And these aircraft carriers and the ships that were with them could go 30. So they were left behind. So the bottom line is because the winds of war were starting to blow, it created the conditions for a concentration of our forces that the Japanese took advantage of. And they did the same thing with our airfields. We were so worried about sabotage by the native Japanese citizenry, or so the story goes that I've read. The reason I say that is the more we learn about World War II, the more we realize that there are these apocryphal stories that aren't necessarily true. And so I got to be really careful. I've read it, and I think that this is still the case, that the U.S. military took our airplanes and grouped them together instead of dispersing them to be able to. No, they did the opposite. They dispersed them instead of grouping them together all over the island to prevent them from being attacked through sabotage. So you couldn't throw one Molotov cocktail into one plane and blow up 10 of them.
Yeah.
Which meant when we needed to sortie planes when we were attacked, everything was spread out. There was no easy way to do it. And the ships were the same way. But I didn't realize there was 96 ships in Pearl Harbor at the time of the attack.
No, I didn't either. And think about it. If they had the aircraft carriers also, you know, and so I mean, there's always been this conspiracy. Did FDR know about Pearl Harbor attack coming and stuff like that? And people point to that and go, see, and they put all the ships in one spot, and they kept the aircraft carriers out so we'd have something to fight with, our best ships, our new weapon and stuff, But you're right. I think, we had so many outposts around. We had Wake Island, we had Midway, we had, and Pearl Harbor was the furthest east.
Yeah, by far.
Who would have thought they would reach that far? I don't believe personally that there was a conspiracy there, but nonetheless, it was pretty scary stuff.
It's fun to think that is a conspiracy, but yeah, I agree with you, Ryan. I think the simplest solution is, what sitting president is willing to just let most of their fleet be blown up when they're the commander in chief and they need to win a war? It's harder to win a war when a bunch of your men are dead. And most of your battleships are sunk. And let's unpack just the Nevada a little bit. Not it's what it did in Pearl Harbor. We'll get to that in a couple of clips. But the Nevada was an old battleship. Mm-hmm. Do you have any information specifically on the Nevada, Ryan?
I do. Let me pull up my.
Because he already mentioned while you're pulling that up that it was an older ship. And it ran on 120 DC current, direct current, which was not common. I looked that up really quickly, and I couldn't find that in any of the other ships that were used.
Doggone it, I don't have it ready here.
No worries.
We'll come back to that. But one of the things he mentioned early on is it was one of two ships. Yep. It was built in 1914, I know, and it was one of two ships that were part of the Nevada class. Sorry, let me move this thing that just popped up over the screen. Two ships in the Nevada class, one being the Oklahoma, and then, of course, being the Nevada and everything. And, the Texas, the battleship Texas was built, was it 1915 that was built, the Texas?
I can't remember, but it's pretty, the Nevada was actually launched and commissioned in 1916. So it was pretty contemporary with the USS Texas. Yeah.
So, I think I remember reading it had something like 10 14-inch guns on the Nevada. Which I was amazed at. I didn't realize that they had that many guns of that size on the ship.
Yeah, 10 14-inch guns. And one of the things about the Nevada is it was the first of what they called the standard type battleships. And what the standard was is it had to be oil burning, and it had what they called an all or nothing armor design, meaning in the past ships would take their armor and kind of spread it out along the ship so there's a little bit of armor everywhere. But the Brits had the idea, it's like, you know what, who cares if the bow gets blown off? Who cares if certain areas of the wardroom are blown up? The bottom line is, if you can armor the parts of the ship that matter the most, which would be the magazines and all the machinery spaces for the engines and whatnot, if you can keep those going, not only will you displace enough water to keep it afloat, but you can keep the ship moving and maybe fighting. And this series was the first one of the standards to have this all or nothing armor design, as well as the type of turrets that they use. So at the time, it was considered a very modern, not just modern, but a very sophisticated, technologically sophisticated warship. By World War II, it was old and dated, right? We would use these throughout the war, but they were, the biggest problem that these ships had is they were slow, like 21 knots. And you can't keep up with the carriers with the 21 knot battle wagon. So what they did with the Nevada and all the ships that were raised from Pearl Harbor and all the older battleships is they put them in a separate battle division during the war and would use those for like bombarding islands or protecting the invasion fleet. And then the faster battleships like the Dakotas and the Iowas, they would cruise around like a bunch of psychos out in the ocean with the aircraft carriers and protect them and provide anti-aircraft fire. So the Nevada had a role, but by the time, I guess to make the long story short, by the time Pearl Harbor was attacked and head was on the Nevada, it was an older ship and kind of dated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you said, like the Texas and like a lot of those ships that were built, part of the dreadnought class from the World War One era, you know.
Yep. And
So, yeah.
I actually think they look kind of cool, those old grungy looking post dreadnought ships. But yeah, they were kind of dated. So he's on the Nevada, and now we know it's an older ship. He likes it. He's an electrician, so he's below deck, right? And so I remember when I was interviewing him, I was kind of like, oh, I'm below deck. I mean, what's he going to see down there and all that? And I wanted somebody up in a crow's nest. But as we get into that, you're going to hear that it's kind of interesting to get the perspective from someone that was below deck trying to keep the ship running. So the next clip, he's going to talk about what the mood was like prior to the attack. I mean, did they anticipate it or not?
Well, I think that everybody more or less felt that it was going to happen sometime. But being down on the totem pole as far as you are, you don't get that kind of information. And of course, you didn't get a daily newspaper to read or anything like that. What you did get was your news on the airways, and of course that being out there, you only had a few stations out there. You didn't get as many stations back as you did in the States, and so I don't think as the bulk of the people I don't think knew how serious the situation was till it happened, and of course, just like when it happened, why it was just there, boom, bang, and you just responded, went to your battle stations, and performed your duties as you needed.
Mhm.
Yeah, the reason I pulled this clip is it's rare for us to run into somebody who was at an event as historic as the Pearl Harbor attack, who can give us his opinion in this case, because we've also interviewed women who were civilians during Pearl Harbor attack. But in this case, Ted's impression of what it was like prior to the attack. I mean, I think today with our news cycle being so saturated, we just assume that everyone knows everything about stuff. But back then, you didn't have Tom Brokaw in the evening news. You would have had newspaper or whatever your officers shared with you that day. And basically, what I thought I heard from him was we knew something was up, but no one thought it would be that, right? And that kind of covers what we were saying before.
Well, and you mentioned, in the previous segment when we were discussing things, as far as like, was this all kind of expected? And you have to think with regard to our government, we knew something was coming for at least a year because, of course, the battle, World War II had started over in Britain and in Europe in 1939, and we had our peacetime draft going.
Yeah.
We had that up and running, and I think we realized then we had better get our crap together here because it looks like we could get pulled into this down the road. So, and the fact that they were, all congregated there at Pearl Harbor. I mean, I think with all the guys there at Pearl Harbor, you'd all have a feeling of like, okay, something's up. There's a lot of people here, a lot of ships in the harbor. Are we getting ready to move out and attack something? I mean, who knows what the scuttlebutt would have been like out at the bars? Can you imagine listening to those guys talk?
Oh, it would have been crazy. And I'm smiling over here because you just brought up something that's kind of like a duh moment for me. So what was the mood before the attack? And he had to been thinking, well, shoot, dude, we knew something was going on. It's the peacetime, and I just joined the military because there's a draft going on. I mean, the fact that he was even there is enough for me to learn about how they would have felt about how imminent something was because they were there. They didn't need to be there. They knew they were there because the threat was real and present.
Yeah.
So on the next clip, we're gonna go right into the Pearl Harbor attack, and there's gonna be some things that he's gonna share that can take you back to the Nevada while this is happening that you can't get anywhere else unless you talk to these dudes. No one's gonna write about it. There's some pretty granular stuff he talks about here.
This is just, I mean, everybody out there, I'm sure you've heard of Pearl Harbor. You know that was the seminal event that got the U.S. into the war. But, a lot of people may not understand why the Japanese attacked us. There was, the Japanese Empire at that time was, of course, growing to be, they had a very formidable navy. They were they were trying to get into China. They had been causing all sorts of problems over there with Shanghai and everything. Basically trying to expand their footprint because they needed more resources to basically fund and sustain their war machine and their economy at the same time as they had these aspirations. And so the U.S. responded to that aggression by, trying to put them in a box and prevent them from taking islands or taking areas that were resource rich. And because of that, we were, I guess you'd say, they were starting to feel the effects of that. And this attack was their way of lashing out at us and trying to strike a quick death blow to our Navy so that they could work with impunity out there and buy themselves 6 or 12 months of being able to just go whole hog on all of these islands out there, all these places that were on their list of real estate that they wanted to own and occupy and harvest from. And that didn't necessarily play out. So, no. Tony, you want to add some things?
No, I think you covered it. The overview is where it is, and the Japanese definitely were resource constrained. They felt squeezed by the United States, where they got most of their oil from, and they went on its blitzkrieg. Now, history matters. So, why would the Japanese feel like attacking the United States was a good idea in 1941? Well, a couple of things. One is they fought in the century before that, in the early 1900s, a war against Imperial Russia at the Battle of Tsushima Straits, where one big, huge naval battle where the Japanese sank just about every Russian ship that made it there. And then the Russians were forced to surrender and to cede land, which ultimately became their toehold into Asia through Korea and then later Manchuria to get iron ore. And so the Japanese had a model where, man, you take this big imperial power and you punch it in the face and it's like, I really don't want any more of this. And then you collect the spoils of war. That's what they thought. And they were wrong.
So that made me think for a second. You mentioned this gigantic defeat of the Russian Navy. That's something, the Russian Navy is not something you heard much about in World War II.
No, in fact, they never really recovered from the Battle of Tsushima, because then what happened is you had World War I, and they were still trying to build up their Navy. And then you had the Russian Revolution, and they were just basically a hot mess for the decades afterwards. Their Navy is just a bit player from that point until the Cold War. And the genesis of that is when the Russians not only had here you can't make this stuff up. The Battle of Tsushima happened after the Japanese did a surprise attack on Port Arthur, where the Russian ships were in harbor. It was a surprise attack. They laid mines. They had destroyers go in there and torpedo boats and sank a bunch of their ships. So there went their first Pacific Squadron in a surprise attack, decimated. They lost their best admiral at the time. The Russians did. And so the Russians sailed the second Pacific Squadron from the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea all the way around the world. I think it's around 1905 when this happened, 1904. Don't quote me on that, but it's early 1900s. And by the time this wreck of a fleet made it to the Tsushima Straits between Korea and Japan, they just got laid to waste. So you had a surprise attack to try to gather resources from a large imperial power that you could never defeat on land, like in a straight up land battle.
Right.
And you use this huge Navy punch in the face to get the Imperial Russian czar at the time to say, all right, I've had enough of this. And they thought that was going to happen in the United States, and it didn't. So why are we going on this kind of extended tour of history? I think one of the things about our podcast that we try to emphasize is that history matters. People remember it. If you understand what happened in the past, it helps you glean insights over things that can and often do happen in the future. Yeah. And people who studied the Battle of Tsushima and a surprise attack, it was a laydown for what ultimately happened at Pearl Harbor.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, so that sets the table for what's coming next. So let's go ahead and dive into Ted's experiences on December 7th, 1941.
All right, Warrior Next Door listeners, please tune in next week as Ted Kuykendall talks about what he experienced on December 7th, 1941, that day of infamy. So you're not going to want to miss it. Please join in.